Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us. I will spare you the long-winded introduction, but just say it's really fun, and please welcome Dr. Andrew Rabin.
Thank you very much. It's very good to see all of you. For those of you who were here last week, welcome back. For those of you for whom this is your first time, you may regret it. Tonight, our theme, politics can be murder. One of the great things about the medieval kings of England is that they really had no shortage of creative ways to die. So we have King Harold, who got an arrow in the eye at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. We have William II, who was killed in a hunting accident when he was mistaken for a deer by the person standing next to him. Oops. Edward II got a red-hot poker shoved up his rear end. And then we have Henry I, who in 1135 died of a surfeit of eels. He just overate, he ate too many eels, which you'd think would be sort of a one-off. But then in 1286, Alexander II of Scotland did it. And then, in the 17th century, there's an entire ballad called Lord Randall about somebody else who died of a surfeit of eels. All of which is to say that if it's the Middle Ages and somebody offers you a plate of eels, stick to the California roll. We're always fascinated by the ways in which our leaders die, and especially what happens when they die by violence. The deaths of our leaders, they capture our imagination because they remind us of some important things. They remind us of the power of tragedy, that somebody who is so highly placed in society nonetheless can be brought low by an assassin's knife or an assassin's bullet. It's impossible to read a book about an assassinated leader, whether it's Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, without having in your head that sort of invisible countdown clock. We know that we are on the inexorable road to February 14th, 1865 at Ford's Theater, or November 22nd in Dallas in 1963. We're reminded of our own vulnerability. If somebody could get to them, how much easier would it be for somebody to get to us? We're also tempted by the long list of what-ifs. Every murder, and especially every political assassination, is the culmination of a series of small decisions, any one of which, had it been made the other way, could have changed the course of history. Had Abraham Lincoln had a full security detail that evening, had the fellow in charge of guarding the door not stepped away for a minute, had John F. Kennedy taken the advice of the Secret Service and had the cover-up on the car he was riding in, history would have been totally different. And of course, we also shouldn't forget the fact that we are compelled by conspiracy theories. When something important happens, when there's some large historical event, and especially when that event involves the death of a prominent figure, the temptation always is to go down that rabbit hole, to think of all of the different ways it might have happened. What are the secret movers behind society? Was Kennedy killed by the CIA? Was Kennedy killed by the Cubans? Was he killed by the communists? Clearly, it could not simply have been a lone shooter in a book depository. There always has to be some more to the story. And so we become sucked in as we try to figure out what more there could be. Tonight, we are going to look at two of the most prominent political assassinations from the Middle Ages in England. First, the assassination in the year 978 of the young king Edward the Martyr. And then, and perhaps one of the most famous assassinations from the Middle Ages, the killing in 1483 of The Princes in the Tower, possibly by their uncle Richard III, famous to everybody from Shakespeare. There are a couple of reasons why these assassinations are particularly worthy of note. One thing to say here is, in both cases, these are the assassination of children. And as we saw last time, in the Middle Ages, people were just as horrified by murder as we are today, and the death of a child had that much more of an impact. In both cases, the murder of the young king, whether it was Edward the Martyr, you shouldn't name your child Edward the Martyr if he's going to get martyred, or whether it was Edward V, the death of the child produced dramatic public mourning, a dramatic public response, because it was not only the killing of a king, it was also the killing of an innocent. It was also the case that in both instances, that the murder of the king exposed the vulnerabilities of society at the time. It was a reminder of the state in the adage from Ecclesiastes, woe to the country that has a king for a child. Or a child for a king, sorry, we've reversed it. And there's one other thing that makes these two murders so compelling. They're both mysteries. In both cases, we're not entirely sure who did it, how, why. So that's what we'll be exploring tonight. And our first murder for the evening, as I said, will be the terrible death of Edward the Martyr. This murder takes place, if you remember our chart from last time, we're back in the first half of English medieval history now, during the Anglo-Saxon period, and this murder takes place right here in 978. So if you want to start situating it historically, the first Viking invasion takes place in 789, and if you remember, there was no England at the beginning of this period. There were just separate kingdoms that were settled by different Germanic tribes. And it's only with the pressure of the Viking invasion, forcing those kingdoms to, you might say, compress and unify, that we start the process towards a united England. That process begins with the reign of Alfred the Great, and it will culminate with the reign of Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan the Great, who in the year 939 will proclaim himself for the very first time King of England. So when we're talking about a murder that takes place in 978, we are only in a country that's or a kingdom that's about 40 years old. So on the one hand, you have a history and a heritage that for the Anglo-Saxons that goes back hundreds of years, but they're also in a new space, in a new kingdom, with a new unified government. That the people around England, not all of themselves still identify themselves as English. The government is still something of, well, it's still a bit fragile. Now, our story begins tonight with the reign, actually, no, it doesn't even begin there. We have to think first about the significance of Edward's martyrdom. This was an event that captured the imagination of Anglo-Saxon England. It was a rupture in history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year chronicle of events that took place during this period, kept by monks at various monasteries, says, "For the English people, no worse deed than this was committed since they first came to Britain." So if we think about all of the different sins that accompany the progress of history, and all of the different horrible ways in which people die, all of the different awful things that kings do, that their nobles do, for the people of Anglo-Saxon England in the 10th and 11th centuries, it was the death of Edward the Martyr that was the most severe crime. It was the death of Edward the Martyr that really exposed the weakness at the core of Anglo-Saxon government and the corruption that afflicted Anglo-Saxon society. So, what's the story? Well, it's a little blurry with the enlargement, but this is an image of Edward's murder from the late 18th century, and it really gives sort of the major features of what happened. So, one morning, the young king was out riding with a small retinue. He was perhaps coming home from hunting, and he decides, I'm going to visit my stepmother, Alfthoreth. There has been a period of political dissension. Edward and Alfred have been on opposite sides of a dispute over the crown and who should be ruling. Edward decides, I'm going to go and visit my stepmother and maybe patch things up. Edward rides into the forecourt of the castle. Alfred comes out offering him a glass of some wine to drink. But as she does so, one of her servants sneaks up behind with a knife and stabs poor Edward in the back. And we get a sense, actually, of sort of how this event was interpreted, in part not just because we have sort of, the beautiful queen, the young king, but you can't really tell here, but of course with the anti-Semitism that was inveterate in the 19th century, our murderer actually has a stereotypically anti-Semitic Jewish nose. So we get the sense here, right? This is a Christ-like act of betrayal, or a Judas-like act of betrayal. And this image has a lot of cultural power behind it. It first appears, actually, in the Middle Ages. So this is an image from a manuscript, 14th century. There is Edward the Martyr. He's got a little beard here. He doesn't look quite as young, but he's being given a glass. And if you can see here, the knife is going right in. It's an image that will be repeated on holy cards. This is a holy card from the 16th century. But not just holy cards, collectible cards from the series Leaders and Legends. Cigarette cards. Nothing says the Marlboro Man, like the assassination of Edward the Martyr. There is even the Lego set. And it's not hard to see why this would be such a compelling story. This is a story of the sacrifice of innocence. This is the story of a young king, pure of heart, pure of mind, pure of soul, who's betrayed by his evil stepmother, again, that fairy tale element that we saw from last class, and who then dies a tragic death, but because of his purity of self, because of his purity of soul, he will be quickly recognized as a saint. And Saint Edward the Martyr is still one of the most prominent saints in the British Isles. Now, there's just one problem with this. Virtually everything here is wrong. It's unclear whether Alfred, the evil stepmother, was even present. There's nothing in any of the accounts about Edward being served some sort of wine or drinking something, right? That's, again, one of those Christ-like additions, right? Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let this cup pass away from me, right? Since we have a saint, we have to have references to the New Testament. It's not even sure that Edward's assassination took place at Alfred's castle. So this is it's one of the most famous images in British history, but it could all be wrong. So let's see what the real story is, or see what we can tell about the real story. What really happened? This is actually a coin of Edward the Martyr, and this is the only contemporary portrait that we have of him. And if we're tracking images of people with large noses, we see that Edward actually is quite well endowed. So, the story of events that led to Edward's assassination begin with the reign of his father, King Edgar the Peacemaker. Edgar comes to the throne in the year 959. By the time Edgar comes to the throne, the new English government is starting to get itself settled. They're enjoying a period of relative peace from Viking invasions, which means that Edgar has the opportunity, he has the ability to focus not on defending the realm from external invaders, but rather rebuilding the kingdom's infrastructure, securing the crown, and renegotiating England's relationships with its neighbors. Among Edgar's greatest accomplishments, he managed for the first time in English history to actually draw submission, to bring the kings of Scotland and Wales into submission. It won't last long. But at least during Edgar's reign, he builds something that is starting to look like a united kingdom, an empire of the British Isles. Now, another major component of Edgar's reign is an emphasis on what was called monastic reform. That is, Edgar wants to restabilize an English church that has been battered by years of Viking incursions. He wants to not only rebuild the infrastructure of the church, all of the monasteries that have been destroyed, all of the church lands that have been taken and stolen. He also wants to restore the centralized administration of the church. The church had been, with the invasions, basically under the control of various secular aristocrats. So most aristocrats would have their own sort of pet monastery, the revenues of which wouldn't go to the church, that wouldn't go to the Pope, it wouldn't go to the Archbishop of Canterbury, it would go to the aristocrat, right? Then as now, everybody loves a tax shelter. And that's basically what early medieval monasteries were for many aristocrats. Edgar wants to bring the church back to the central role that it should play in a Christian society. Now, he's assisted in this by two major ecclesiastics. One of them, Archbishop Dunstan of Canterbury, that's St. Dunstan, that actually is a self-portrait. So that is what Dunstan looked like, or at least the way in which he portrayed himself. Dunstan was a figure of rigid morality. It tells you something of Dunstan's character. There was a very popular story that went around, which is undoubtedly false, but so good that we're going to treat it as true. When Edgar's father, Eadred, came to the throne, on the day of his marriage, Eadred, being excited by the prospects of marriage, slips away from the wedding party with his new bride and his new bride's mother. And they find themselves a private room and begin canoodling. Suddenly, the Archbishop of Canterbury jumps in and threatens Eadred with hellfire if he doesn't return to the wedding and keep his hands off his bride's mom. Clearly not true, but what better motivation for celibacy than the thought that if you're in a private moment, suddenly the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to jump out of a closet at you. So that's Dunstan. He is the leading ecclesiastic in England. He is a fierce protector of the church's rights and prerogatives, not just against the aristocracy, but even against the king himself. Though he has a very good relationship with Edgar in a way that he won't with Edgar's successors. Now, the other major ecclesiastic of the period is Bishop Ethelwold of Winchester, the first of a number of very silly names we're going to be seeing today. And this actually is a contemporary portrait of Ethelwold. You can see there's some problems with the oxidation of the ink, but nonetheless, that's more or less what Ethelwold probably looked like. Ethelwold was the Bishop of Winchester. Now, during the Anglo-Saxon period, Winchester, not London, was the capital of England. And so the Bishop of Winchester is uniquely placed at the center of England's politics to influence the king and influence the way in which the political fortunes of the church developed. Ethelwold was a tremendous scholar and also operated one of the most influential church schools in England. So there is an entire generation of clerical leaders who will all be descended, at least intellectually, from Ethelwold. Like Dunstan, an individual of tremendous importance. If we associate Dunstan with the, you might say, rigid moral purity of the church, Ethelwold here, he's more associated with the political side of the church, especially through his closeness with the king. And the three of them together, Dunstan, Edgar, and Ethelwold, they will collaborate on this project of rebuilding the English church. Now, the thing is, they are not necessarily without opposition in this. In fact, the aristocracy, they're all quite opposed to this project of rebuilding the church because from their perspective, they are losing lands, they are losing sources of income, they are losing spheres of influence. What they see is a king with the assistance of the church centralizing his power and gaining the ability to exert more power over them. They then are losing their independence, they then are losing their authority, they then are losing political influence. Now, Edgar, for all of his qualities as a king, he does have a weakness: the ladies. Edgar will have multiple romantic entanglements during his lifetime, 3 of them being most important for our purposes. His first is with a woman named Ethelfled Eneda, which is, her name was actually the White Swan. That's what that means. There are no, or not, sorry, not White Swan, White Duck. There are no images of Ethelfled, so I just picked a white duck. We don't know whether Edgar ever married Ethelfled, but we do know that they had a child named Edward. Now, at a certain point, Ethelfled disappears from the scene. We don't know why, whether she died, whether she was just put away in a monastery, but that relationship ends. Now, Edgar, eager for companionship, does what any enterprising royal would do. He rides over to the closest nunnery and grabs himself a nun. And in this case, it's a nun named Wulfthryth. She will go on to be known as a saint. He will bring her back to the castle. They will, at least as the story goes, be rapidly married, though there is some historical question as to whether that happened, and engage in a very brief, some say as short as an hour, sexual relationship, out of which is produced a daughter, Edith, who will also go on to become a saint. Finally, there is, oh gosh, the enlargement really is sort of killing us here. There is his final wife, and the one woman that we can say absolutely he did marry, a woman named Ælfthryth, who's the mother of a boy named Ethelred. Now, Ælfthryth is a truly remarkable woman. She marries the king in the year 964. She is the very first woman to be crowned Queen of England. And this is an important stage in the development of English governance. Prior wives of kings had essentially been adjuncts of the king's body. They were the king's bedfellows. Ælfthryth is the first woman to take that role of being the king's wife and say, no, I'm not just a sexual object, I'm not just someone who's here for the comfort of the king's physical body or for the production of heirs. I have a real, meaningful, and specific role at court and role in the governance of the kingdom. So this is somebody who exercised a tremendous amount of power at Edgar's court during his day. She's also the first woman known to have acted as an advocate in a legal proceeding. So as part of her understanding of her role as queen, she would take those who she patronized, she would, if they fell into a legal dispute, she would actually go into court and argue their cases. She's also notable for having founded Werrell Abbey, where she will briefly serve as abbess before returning to the court. So this is somebody who, though she had a religious profile, this is somebody who really wanted to be a politician. And we get a sense of the kind of role she played if we look at a text that is produced in Edgar's reign called the Regularis Concordia, the rule for, or the agreement with the church, between the crown and the church. And it says in the Regularis Concordia that Edgar most wisely ordered that his wife, Ælfthryth, should defend communities of nuns like a fearless sentinel. So notice there she's being compared with a warrior, like a fearless sentinel, so that naturally a man might aid men and a woman might aid women without a breath of scandal. So part of the role of Ælfthryth here is she's very specifically being positioned as an advocate for the women of the kingdom, and especially an advocate for the religious women of the kingdom. All right, so you have these different power centers. You have Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury. You have Ethelwold, the Bishop of Winchester. You have the King Edgar. And you have his wife, Ælfthryth. All of these people are dedicated to the centralization of monarchical power and the reform of the church. But that doesn't mean they actually get along together. If we want to say, sort of describe how they got along, kind of like the Beatles around 1964. They're all playing more or less the same music. That doesn't mean they can stand to be in a room with one another. Dunstan sees Ethelwold as corrupt, as too much the prey of the king. The king and Ethelwold see Dunstan as a moral stick in the mud. Nobody likes this woman who's running around exercising power, but everybody gets along with Ringo. All right, so what happens in the year 975? The king is dead. We don't know what Edgar died of. He died at the age of 35, a relatively young age, though we do know that men in the line of Alfred tended to be very sickly, and none of them lived for a very long time. So there's no reason to think there was anything untoward about his death. He died at a similar age to most of the other men, most of the other kings in his family. But we do know that his death was sudden and unexpected. And what that meant was there was suddenly a question of who should sit on the throne. Because we have two eligible male heirs. The son of Ethelfled the White Duck, Edward, and the son of Elfrith, Ethelred. Now, if we trace the ways in which both kings or both princes are represented at court up until Edgar's death, it starts with Edward being very clearly identified as the heir. He signs charters right after Edgar as princeps. However, with the rise of Alfrith, Edward gets replaced by the young Ethelred. So we have two people who claim the throne and two factions behind them. And that factionalization is important because it's also the case that Edward is about 11 and Ethelred's about 9. So when we talk about these two people who could claim the throne, really what we're talking about is the figureheads for two factions at court. One of them is the faction that's behind Dunstan, the church faction, supporting King Edward, or supporting the future King Edward. The other faction supports Ethelred, and that's Alfrith and Ethelwold. They will essentially duke it out, and you'll have a succession crisis, there'll be a brief civil war, but ultimately, Edward will assume the throne, Ethelred will be marginalized, and Alfrith will retreat to her castle in the southern coast of England at Corfe. Now, Edward reigns for about 3 turbulent years. One of the most important things that defines these years is something called the anti-monastic reaction. Essentially what happens is all of those aristocrats who opposed Edgar's attempts to centralize and stabilize the English church, they look at a child on the throne, they look at a weak king, and they say, it's time to get ours back. So this 3 years of Edward's reign sees a series of raids on the church, a series of pillagings of major monasteries as regional aristocrats try to reclaim the power that they'd lost. So the reign of this future Saint Edward is actually not a great period for the church. In fact, Edward himself was not an especially great guy. It says about Edward, he struck not only by one of his contemporaries, Edward struck not only fear, but even terror into everyone. He hounded them not only with tongue lashings, but even with cruel beatings. And most of all, those who were members of his own household. So, yeah, he became a saint, but he was actually a little jerk. Which is not surprising, let's face it. This is a spoiled teenager. What do you expect? Right? He's probably sitting on the throne, looking at his phone, being like, I don't want to feel like ruling. Go beat that servant or something. All right, so what happens? Well, 18 March 978. We're told that Edward was out riding with a small retinue. After traveling, possibly hunting, but certainly just out on some sort of excursion, he comes to Elfrith's castle at Corfe. And we're told by Beardfirth of Ramsey, who's our major source for these events, that the magnates and leading men, so the aristocrats at Corfe, went to meet him as was only fitting. Ethelred remained inside with the Dowager Queen, his mother. So Alfrith is not outside at this point. She's still up in the castle with Ethelred. Now, the magnates had agreed amongst themselves a wicked plot. They were possessed of so damnable an intention and so murky and diabolical a blindness that they did not fear to lay hands on God's anointed. He rides into the forecourt when the conspirators surrounded him, and it was just as the Jews surrounded our Lord, so there you have that subtle hint of anti-Semitism, not all that subtle, slipping in. He remained sitting on his horse, fearless. So we actually have an almost, we see the origins of this saints cult here, and he's writing already 22 years after the event. So there's the proud Edward sitting nobly on his horse as the evil conspirators surrounded him like Brutus and Cassius surrounded Caesar. The soldiers laid hold of him. One on his right hand drew him towards him as if he wished to give him a kiss, the Judas kiss. Another grabbed his left side firmly and gave him the death blow. And the king shouted out as best as he could, "What are you doing, breaking my right hand?" In later versions of this narrative, he will say something appropriately Christ-like, right? Oh God, why have you forsaken me? Why do you persecute me so? But the earliest record is, in fact, what are you doing breaking my right hand? Which has a sort of nice tinge of realism to it. And suddenly, he fell from his horse and was dead. And that was the murder of Edward the Martyr. So let's take a look at the suspects. Suspect number 1, Alfrith. She certainly has a motive to regain power and to place her son Ethelred on the throne. There are some reasons why we should believe she did it. Number 1, location. It took place at her castle. So it's sort of hard to believe that she was not in any way involved. It's extremely politically advantageous to her. The actual murderers, right, whoever actually drew the knife, struck the blow, we have no record of anybody ever actually being imprisoned, tortured, or executed for it. Nobody ever actually investigated this murder. So if we think about this murder as perpetrated or initiated by somebody with considerable power, certainly she is somebody who could affect that. She mysteriously disappears from court for about a decade after the murder. And some people have suggested that perhaps during that period she goes on a penitential pilgrimage to Rome. So certainly if this is somebody who has committed the mortal sin of killing God's anointed, a penitential pilgrimage would certainly explain why she disappears from court. Also, medieval historians are unanimous in saying Alfrith did it. But that's not the whole story. Why didn't she do it? Well, first of all, the first accusations don't appear until actually about 250 years after the event. So at which point, any real historical record, any real historical memory of this event has faded away. And in fact, the accusations that Alfrith did it are all tinged with really generic misogyny. Alfrith is the evil stepmother. Alfrith is the witch. There's a great story, one version of this, she colluded with Ethelwold, who actually used to hide in her closet so that the two of them could have sex. Ethelwold also was a saint. That wasn't happening. But nonetheless, she becomes the figure for the evil stepmother, the rapaciously sexual woman, the woman who is trying to step out of her proper role as subordinate to men, which means that we should treat those accusations with a certain amount of suspicion. Now, there's another reason we should be suspicious. The term used in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle about the location of the murder is essentially the Corfe approach, which could mean a couple of things. It could mean the forecourt of the castle, as it was depicted in those images that we looked at earlier. It could also mean the roads leading towards the castle. Corfe Castle is in a very mountainous area. To get to the castle, you have to go through basically a series of valleys and mountain passageways. So it's very possible this murder did not actually take place at the castle, but at one of the surrounding roads. She mysteriously disappears from court for about a decade after the murder, as we said. Maybe it wasn't a penitential pilgrimage. Maybe the murder was committed by somebody else and she's actually deliberately excluded from power. They don't want the meddling, interfering old queen getting in the way. And finally, there is that evil stepmother trope. It's just a little bit too fairy tale appropriate for Ælfthryth to have committed the murder. So what about other suspects? Well, the next sort of obvious suspect would be rebellious aristocrats, right? They've started taking land back from the church. Why not seize and assassinate the king also? Why would they do it? Power. Evidence that they did it well, if you remember that account of the murder that Byrhtferth gave, right? He says that the murder was committed while Ælfthryth and her son were inside, away from the action, and it was all planned by the magnates and lords of the realm. So that's a very clear accusation right there, right? One that exonerates Ælfthryth and says, no, this was an aristocratic conspiracy. It's possible that we could see this as an act of retribution for what was called the incident at Calne, which is part of one of the miracles of St. Dunstan. Essentially what happens is that the various disputants over the church and over who should hold the throne meet at a place called Calne, a meeting called by Dunstan himself. Dunstan rises to address this meeting full of his political opponents when, magically, mysteriously, the floor collapses and they're all killed. Dunstan is only saved because, through the intervention of God, he happened to be holding on to a beam in the roof at the appropriate time. There's some question as to whether this event actually happened. It certainly wasn't a miracle if it did, but it could very well have been a conspiracy on the part of Edward's followers led by Dunstan to eliminate their political opponents, in which case the murder of Edward would make a lot of sense both as retribution and as an act of political protection, right? If they're going to act against us, we need to move first. Finally, there's a major text written some years later by Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who's the most important figure of the 11th century English church and one of the most important figures of the 11th century English government. He actually writes the laws for Kings Ethelred and Canute. And he gives this major homily in front of the lords of the realm called the Sermon of the Wolf to the English, in which he says very explicitly, "This is a kingdom that has been corrupted through betrayal. In this kingdom, fathers betray their sons, sons betray their fathers, families betray each other, friends betray each other, neighbors betray each other, and lords betray their king, as happened with the martyred King Edward." So there's a moment again where we have a very, very clear accusation. The lords did it. But why couldn't they have done it? Well, one thing to say is that the makeup of court doesn't significantly change after the assassination. So if this is a power grab by a particular faction of aristocrats, where did that faction go, right? Wouldn't they have come to power and there have been some sort of change in the makeup of court? There does not appear to have been one. This involves a certain amount of conspiratorial thinking. We have no names associated with this. For all of the powerful aristocrats in the country, at no point does somebody say, oh yes, at the center of this conspiracy was person X. So even though the lords are accused, it's very, very hazy. It's very, very vague. There are no subsequent accusations. So once the sort of period of the assassination passes, as we move into later history and the historical memory of the event fades, nobody else ever goes back and says, actually, no, it was the aristocracy, it was the lords that did it. So, still not great candidates. What about person or persons unknown, including Edward's old servants? Right? We're already told that Edward was particularly cruel to his servants, beating them, right? Motive? Well, why does anybody do anything? But clearly he was a pretty awful person. Why they did it? Well, if this took place in the Corfe approach, away from the castle, Edward's riding without much of a retinue. He's certainly very vulnerable at this point. So you don't need to say that we have aristocrats plotting something. It's a moment when it would be very easy for servants to turn on the king, or even for brigands or outlaws to attack him. Edward is known for his abusive behavior. People don't seem to have liked him. Wulfstan's sermon could also be read not as lords turning against their king, but as servants turning against their king. So that could be a reference not to the aristocracy, but it could be a reference to Edward's servants. The thing is, once again, the murderers are never pursued or arrested. So if the servants did it, you would think that people would be invested in punishing them. No evidence that anything ever happened. And no accusations. This scenario is never imagined by a by somebody in the Middle Ages. This is something that's speculated by modern historians. So we're stuck without an answer. But what are the consequences of this murder? They're actually pretty significant. With the death of Edward, his younger brother Ethelred comes to the throne. And if you've heard of Ethelred, you've probably heard of him associated with his famous nickname, Ethelred the Unready. It's actually a pun. The name Ethelred literally means noble counsel, the wise. Unrad, the Old English Unrad, means no counsel. So his nickname is basically Ethelred the Idiot. And he proves to be a completely inept king. During his reign, the Viking invasions will resume. Over the course of those invasions, Ethelred's government will collapse. He's going to be forced to flee England. And a new king, Canute, will take the throne. Where does Ethelred flee? He flees to the north of France. And that's where his son, named Edward, after Edward the Martyr, will grow up. These will provide the first connections between England and Normandy that will ultimately culminate in the Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard, later becoming King of England, William the Conqueror. So this is an event that potentially could be seen as having real and significant historical impact. What do we know about what happened to Edward himself after the assassination? Well, that's also a fairly interesting story. Edward, after he's killed, is very, very quickly buried without ceremony. And there's no indication at this point that anybody saw Edward as anything other than a dead king. He's not a saint at this point. Everybody still kind of dislikes him. But because he's a child, over the course of the next year or so, he starts gaining a reputation for purity. Until about a year after his murder, almost exactly, on April 5th, his cult has grown sufficiently that Edward's body is moved from its location to the monastery at Salisbury, where he will be given a saint's burial. Now, it's important that this happens on April 5th because it's right before the coronation of Edward's brother, Ethelred. So this is also very clearly a propaganda move. Ethelred, having come to power under mysterious circumstances, even though there's no way he personally was guilty, he nonetheless has to distance himself from the trial and distance himself from the assassination, and the best way to do that is make himself a patron of the new saints cult. The saintly reputation of Edward will gradually grow and grow. It'll only be magnified when his namesake, King Edward the Confessor, will also become a saint. So we have two major Edwardian saints in England. And this will continue until the Reformation. In the year 1532, the Salisbury monastery will be destroyed. It will be pillaged by agents of Henry VIII. And Edward's bones will be lost for about 400 years. In between, sometime around 1930, 1932, really in between those years, an amateur archaeologist will start excavating the monastery at Salisbury, the monastery that had been destroyed, and he finds bones. Bones of a child who's roughly the right age to be Edward, who suffered from a number of severe injuries during his death that more or less correspond to those that Edward suffered. The implication is these bones are very, very likely those of Edward. Well, our amateur archaeologist is thrilled. And he says, I will give this to a church. I will give these bones to a church, but only one that will venerate Edward as a saint. Well, this is a problem because we've had a Reformation, right? And the English church, at this point being Protestant, isn't so thrilled about venerating a Catholic king as a saint. So nobody really wants him. Until 1980, when the Russian Orthodox Church in England says, we'll take the bones. Right in the middle of the Cold War. There is a huge scandal. You have historians writing into the newspapers, nothing would offend an Anglo-Saxon king more than to be associated with dirty communists. direct quote, like Edward would really care or know what that meant. There's a massive court case that will drag on for 8 years. Ultimately, the Russian Orthodox Church will win, and that's where he is now, in the Russian Orthodox Church of St. Edward the Martyr. And there's a certain appropriate irony with changes in ritual practice and religious belief over the course of the last 1,000 years. In fact, the Russian Orthodox Church probably has the belief system that would have been closest to the one that Edward adhered to while alive. So it's sort of appropriate that he would end up there. That is the story of Edward the Martyr. Now there's a postscript here. We have another young saint, a fellow by the name of Kenelm. Kenelm is the son of Cointhryth, the king of Mercia, who dies in the year 819, 821, we're not entirely sure. When young Kenelm is 7 years old, Kenelm has an older sister, Cointhryth. Cointhryth is deeply jealous of her younger brother. She asks her lover to murder him so that she can assume the throne. So the younger brother takes young Kenelm out hunting, draws his sword. Kenelm, having the wisdom of a saint, says to him, "I know what is going to happen now, but I am at peace with my soul and at peace with God." And he stretches out his neck and accepts martyrdom, and thus becomes, like Edward, a child royal saint. Except for one thing. We know a lot more about Kenelm now than they did in the Middle Ages. Kenelm was not particularly saintly. Kenelm did not die as a child. He actually was 35 when he died. And Kenelm wasn't murdered. What happens? Well, the worship of St. Kenelm starts appearing in the early 11th century, shortly after the martyrdom of Edward. What's happened? Anglo-Saxon church historians have looked back at a period in English history where there's not great historical attestation. In fact, there's about a 15-year gap in the records of Kenelm's life. And so they look at this gap and they think, oh, well, we have to fill this in. They don't see the latter bits. And they say, oh, well, clearly this must have been a child martyr, just like Edward. So what they essentially do is take the Edward story and use it as a paradigm for the story of another child king murdered by an evil female relative with a name with Thrith as a particle in it. As we saw last time, similar stories end up supporting and confirming one another. The fact that Kenelm's story so resembles Edward's, even though it's completely made up, means that it must have been true. And you can still visit churches dedicated to St. Kenelm, the non-child, non-martyred, non-saint, today. So, yeah. Peace out, dudes. That's actually an image from the well of St. Kenelm, so it's one of our early images of Kenelm. I kind of like it just because he's sitting there like... All right, so let's jump ahead now, several hundred years, to the mystery of the princes in the tower. And now we are going from all the way back in the early period to the year 1483, right at the end, right when we are in the middle of the Wars of the Roses. Nobody, unless you are a professional historian, really has a good grasp on the Wars of the Roses because it's a period of tremendous chaos. There will not be a test at the end. But essentially what happens, Edward III, his oldest son, Edward the Black Prince, dies, and so his grandson, Richard II, comes to the throne. Richard II proves to be a terrible king, dies without issue. He's actually murdered by the fellow who succeeds him, Henry IV. Henry IV will be succeeded by Henry V. Henry V will be succeeded by Henry VI. Henry VI will prove to be an incompetent king. He cannot hold the throne. It's been suspected, actually, that Henry VI possibly had some sort of mental disorder. It's been suggested that perhaps he had Down syndrome or some other issue, because he appears to have been a very, very kind man and a very simple man, but not an effective ruler. And so in the midst of his incompetence, another branch of the royal family decides, well, if Henry IV could kill the king and become king, why can't we? And so Edward, from this branch of the family, the Yorkist branch, he will overthrow Henry VI. He will then be succeeded by his son, Edward V, who, as we're going to see in a minute, may have been killed by Richard III. There's no way to remember all of these details. What you can remember is essentially the War of the Roses, a battle between two parts of a family. One, the Lancastrian family, the Red Rose, the other, the Yorkist family, the White Rose. The crown is a political football during this period, bouncing back and forth between families as each one goes to war with the other one and each one kills the other. Now, the important king for our purposes here is that fellow Edward. Edward comes to the throne very early. He seizes the throne from Henry VI when he's only 21 years old. And in the year 1471, he actually defeats Henry and murders him at the Tower of London. You can still visit the spot. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, and he will then, at least as is thought at the time, end the War of the Roses and be the sole rightful king of England. He's a pretty good king, but he has a very familiar weakness: the ladies. In 1464, he will secretly marry a woman by the name of Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville comes from a very wealthy family, but not an aristocratic one. This is a totally inappropriate marriage, especially when the king did it in secret without the consent of the court. It's especially problematic because Elizabeth has 12 living siblings, which means, and this is actually the Woodville family, a lot of people claiming or trying to claim favors from Edward, pushing out the hereditary aristocracy. So you have this up-and-coming family that's greedily seizing the gold, greedily seizing political office. Everybody hates them at court, especially Edward's two younger brothers, George, the Duke of Clarence, and Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. George, the Duke of Clarence, will eventually rise up in revolt against his brother, and in 1478 will be seized and killed. If you've read the Shakespeare play, you've heard that he was betrayed by Richard and killed by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey, a large cask of wine. He wasn't. He wasn't betrayed by Richard, and he didn't drown. He was executed in the proper fashion for revolt. But what about our friend Richard? Richard is one of the great boogeymen of English history. He's one of the great villains, thanks especially to two men, Thomas More and William Shakespeare. Following the accession of Henry VII, after he kills Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Thomas More, a major figure at court, until he himself is killed by Henry VIII, will write a history of Richard III, which is flat-out character assassination. Richard, he says, was born after a gestation period of about 2 years. Think about that. He was born with claws, hair, a hunchback. He's a monster. And this monster killed his nephews, ruled as a tyrant, and was rightfully killed by that noble king, Henry VII, who rules the kingdom today. Shakespeare picks up on this and writes one of his greatest plays featuring one of his greatest villains. And that will eventually enter into popular culture. It's an image of Laurence Olivier from his film Richard III. I picked it because it sort of fits with the theme for today. Laurence Olivier, to emphasize Richard's treachery, wore a large anti-Semitic fake nose. Right, so what do we know factually about Richard III? Well, he's born on 2nd October 1452. At the age of 17, he's named Duke of Gloucester. And at the age of a year later, at the age of 18, he's named Constable of England and Chamberlain of Wales. So thanks to his brother's elevation to the throne, he also very quickly acquires a great deal of power. He is known in his time as being an individual of tremendous bravery and tremendous military skill. And he actually commands Edward's vanguard in the Battle of Tewkesbury when he's only 18 years old. So his brother entrusts him with a major portion of his army when he's still only a teenager, and he is successful in that. In 1471, he becomes Lord High Admiral of England and the Great Chamberlain. He marries in 1472, and by the time Edward will eventually die, in 1483, he will be the largest landholder and leading aristocrat in the north of England. What kind of person was he? Well, we actually have contemporary testimony. This is from a fellow named Dominic Mancini, who met Richard in 1482 and wrote a letter about him. He kept himself within his own lands and set out to acquire the loyalty of his people through favors and justice. The good reputation of his private life and public activities powerfully attracted the esteem of strangers. Such was his renown in warfare that whenever a difficult and dangerous policy had to be undertaken, it would be entrusted to his direction and his generalship. By these arts, Richard acquired the favor of the people and avoided the jealousy of the queen, from whom he lived far separated. So Richard was actually seen as a pretty good guy in his time. And one of the great things about Richard is we actually know more about Richard than pretty much any other medieval king, because in the year 2014, in one of the greatest archaeological accomplishments of the 21st century, we discovered his body. And by analyzing his bones, we knew, for instance, that he actually did have spinal curvature. He wasn't a hunchback, he had scoliosis. We can tell what he ate, how he lived. We know from precisely which wounds he died. So we actually know quite a bit about Richard physically. Richard is a powerful figure at court, and as we just saw, he's a tremendously, there's a tremendous amount of political antagonism between him and the Woodvilles. 1483, unexpectedly, at the age of 40, Edward dies. So you notice we have a very similar moment here. Just as with the death of Edgar, 600 years earlier, the king dies suddenly without having made proper provision for the continuance of the throne. He is succeeded by his young son, Edward V, born in 1470, and Edward will also have a younger brother, Richard, the Duke of York, who's born in 1473. They are, at this point, Edward at least, is the person who should rule England, but it doesn't work out that way. With the death of Edward IV, they start a process of moving to meet up with their regent, with the person who's going to be their guardian, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. So on 9th April 1483, Edward dies. 29th April 1483, Richard, as Lord Chamberlain, he takes custody of the boys, but then he arrests everybody in their retinue, all of whom are Woodvilles, all of whom are his political enemies. 4th of May 1483, he delays Edward's coronation, which he will do multiple times. 19th of May 1483, Edward is brought to the Tower of London. 16th June, you notice events are moving very, very rapidly here. Edward's joined by his younger brother Richard, not Richard III, younger Richard, Duke of York, and the coronation is at this point indefinitely postponed. Mid-June 1483, the final time the princes are seen alive at the Tower of London. By 22nd June, the brother of the Lord Mayor of London preaches a sermon at St. Paul's Cross declaring young Edward illegitimate and saying that the true heir of the old King Edward was in fact his brother Richard. 25th June, Richard arraigns for two high-ranking members of the Woodville family, 2nd Earl Rivers and Sir Richard Grey, to be executed. So the young king, whether he's still alive at this period or not, his supporters are very rapidly disappearing. Also on the 25th of June, a group of lords and knights petition Richard to say, please, for the good of the kingdom, you must take the throne that is rightfully yours. The princes are declared illegitimate, and Richard III becomes king on 6th July. And by January of the next year, the first rumors begin to circulate that the young princes have been killed by their uncle. So let's take a look at our suspects. Richard III, motive to gain power or ensure his safety against the Woodvilles. The fact is, had Richard not seized the throne, he very likely would have been arrested by the Woodvilles and killed. So he's both seizing the throne, but he's also engaging in an act of self-protection. Why did he do it? Well, timing's the big one, right? The princes disappeared in mid-1483. If he didn't kill them, if they were killed, say, by Henry VII, as some have suspected, where were they for 2 years? You can't just hide a king. He had means, motive, and opportunity. The crime was supposedly committed by somebody named James Terrell, who, before he died, confessed to the murder, though that may have been Tudor propaganda. While Richard was alive, people thought he did it. And in fact, Henry VII's Bill of Attainder, where he said, "This is why I am rightfully King of England," he accuses Richard III of shedding infants' blood. But why didn't Richard III do it? Well, people point out it is out of character for him. I mean, this is somebody who was beloved as being a kind and beneficent ruler. Why would he kill these children? Most of the accusations really do come down to Tudor propaganda. So how trustworthy are they? Importantly, there are no bodies. If the young King Edward was dead, it's all in Richard's benefit to display his body to show the king lives no more. Not great forensic science at the time. It's not that hard to prop up a king and say, "Oh yeah, no, he didn't die by violence at all. It was all natural. Just got sick and..." So why didn't he do that? It would have helped him. There are other folks who have equal or greater motives. During the reign of Henry VII, these two people, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, great medieval names, show up, and they actually claim to be the murdered Edward V and his younger brother Richard. Could they have been telling the truth? Finally, the great Renaissance historian Raphael Holinshed, who was one of Shakespeare's major sources, says Richard purged and declared his innocence regarding the murder of his nephews. So, at least by some Renaissance historians, Richard did prove himself or demonstrate himself to be innocent. So if Richard III didn't do it, who else might have? Well, it might have been his greatest supporter, Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, to support Richard. He's the only other person other than Richard to be accused by his contemporaries. He had tremendous power over the court. It was in the vice of the Duke of Buckingham, and he's the only person with access other than Richard to the princes. For him, it wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing if the bodies never turned up. However, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to believe that we have done it without Richard's permission or knowledge. Moreover, the Duke of Buckingham will eventually rebel against Richard, be arrested, and executed himself. If that was the case, why didn't Richard at that point say, "The Duke of Buckingham killed the princes"? He had every reason to do so, but he didn't. So maybe it wasn't the Duke of Buckingham. Well, what about Henry VII? To secure his place on the throne. Why did he do it? He had the motive. He didn't want any lingering members of the previous dynasty popping up. Why didn't he do it? Come on! If the kids disappeared in 1483 and he comes to the throne 2 years later, we have to imagine a tremendous conspiracy. Beyond anything that happened any other time that we know of in medieval history. It just beggars the imagination. Moreover, once again, the bodies don't turn up. It would have been to Henry VII's benefit to have a dead body to show. Even to say, here's the dead prince, he was killed by Richard. So if he doesn't have the bodies, and he has every motive to display the bodies, again, good reason to think that he didn't do it. It seems pretty obvious who the guilty one is here. It's almost certainly Richard III, and that's what most historians agree upon. But nonetheless, we still talk about the mystery of the princes in the tower. Why is this a mystery? Well, this illustrates one of the dangers in the study of medieval history. And the danger is looking back at figures in the past and turning them into the people that we want them to be. There are groups of people, Richard was popular in his lifetime, and he's become more popular as time has passed as just a sort of compelling figure. We look back at Richard and we say, well, maybe he was wronged. We would love for him to have been wronged. Richard, everybody said during his lifetime he was a pretty good person. Why would such a good person have killed his nephews? Now, what this ignores the fact is that Richard lived in an age very different from ours. And the notion of what it meant to be a good person or a bad person meant something very different back then. And as we saw, Richard killing the boys would have been really pretty close to a political and personal necessity. So we may look back at Richard and find him to be a really, really sympathetic figure. But nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because we don't want him to have killed the princes, he didn't do it. And there's another thing going on too. Very famous book, very famous mystery. Some of you may have read it, Josephine Tey's Mystery, The Daughter of Time. This is one of those golden age mysteries by a contemporary of Agatha Christie. It's a great book. It is a terrific book. I can't recommend it highly enough. In it, her main detective, Inspector Allen, is laid up in the hospital, and he decides he's going to investigate who really killed the princes. And he decides that it must have been Henry VII. Why? Henry VII is a lot uglier than Richard III. I love the smile there, like those perfect medieval teeth, right? Henry VII, he says, has the face of a murderer. You can tell just by looking at him. Not the best argument for an accusation of murder. Well, what happens to the boys? In the year 1674, a staircase is sort of being demolished at the tower, and the bones of two young children are found of appropriate age who very likely could be the princes in the tower. They are ordered buried at Westminster Abbey by the current king, Charles II, predecessor to our Charles III. And they're buried actually right next to the tomb of Henry VII. And there they lie. There are a couple of problems, though. First of all, these aren't the only children's bones to be found at the Tower of London, which raises a whole other set of questions. Second, Edward IV and his wife Elizabeth were buried at Windsor. And in the 19th century, when there was some excavation going on at Windsor, there's actually a vault discovered behind and connected to Edward IV's where there are the bodies of two young boys. In a decision that is astounding to anybody who has a brain in their head. They look at those tombs and they're like, huh, and they seal them up again without any investigation. Queen Elizabeth II always refused to have any biological DNA testing done on either the bones in Westminster Abbey or the bones at Windsor. Charles III, it has been said, is actually more open to it. So now we all sit and wait for some new discovery. And believe it or not, I am pleased to announce, breaking news, there is one. This was just announced a month ago. So right now we are on the cutting edge of medieval historical study. There was a discovery in the National Archives of a will from 1516 of a woman named Mary Capel, in which she bequeaths to her son Sir Giles his father's chain, which was owned by the young king Edward V. So this was the royal chain, which is supposed to be buried with the king. So I mean, if a kid's assassinated and his body hidden, certainly the chain would go missing. And we know something else. Mary Capel, sister-in-law to James Tyrrell, the fellow who supposedly committed the murder. So this is new evidence that it was, in fact, Richard III. So, to bring everything together, what does this tell us? What conclusions can we draw? First, when we think about political assassinations, they really say a lot about the qualities of good kingship in the Middle Ages. Good kings had two jobs: to protect the realm during their lifetime and ensure its stability after their deaths. When they fail in that second job, that's what creates a space for the kind of disruption that a political assassination causes. Second, it shows us how vulnerable kings actually are. Many kings during this period are assassinated. So even though these are people at the center of society, the leading military figures of their time, people who are conceived of as being anointed by God, nonetheless, there doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of compunction about offing them periodically. It tells us something about the importance of the royal body, right? Both of the stories we talked about tonight really focus on bodies: the youthful body, the stabbed or wounded body, the missing body. Kings were said in the Middle Ages to have two bodies: a physical body and a spiritual body. The physical body dies, the spiritual body of kingship persists on. It's why we say the king is dead, long live the king. The king may die, but kingship continues. This is a great example of the way in which that physical body of the king was understood. Finally, we next see the connection between a political assassination and propaganda. In both cases, the killing of these young men were very convenient for somebody, whether it was the mother-in-law, the aristocrats, the new king. And their death, after it occurs, is very, very quickly seized upon as a means of promoting the new regime. So political assassinations are not just useful for getting somebody out of the way, they're useful when you want to tell the story of why your government has a right to be in power, why you are the rightful king. Finally, and I think this is actually the most interesting one, in point of fact, none of these assassinations were actually all that important. That is, in both cases, the killing of these kings really just accelerated historical movements that were already underway. Viking invasions in England were already ramping up. It's very unlikely that Edward would have been any more successful a king than Ethelred was. Canute certainly would have conquered England in 1016, setting up the 1066 conquest, whether Edward was murdered or not. Richard III remained on the throne for 2 years after the probable deaths of Edward V and Richard. He was defeated not because he killed the boys, whether he killed them. He was defeated because he was confronted by somebody with a greater army and more wealth behind him. He would have had his downfall whether those boys were alive or not. And the fact is, in both cases, the death of the king actually didn't make much of a difference to the people living in the kingdom at the time. Their lives continued largely untouched, even though a king was dead. Outside of the immediate world of the court, most people wouldn't necessarily have noticed any change with the death of the king. So on the one hand, the killing of a king is a moment of massive historical importance, but also, in its own way, it's a moment of no importance at all. So that's what we have to say for tonight. Come back next week and we'll talk about saints, martyrs, and murderers. Same medieval bat time, same medieval bat channel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
No? Well, we did go a little long today. Oh, we do have a question. Yes?
Could you explain the word medieval? I mean, was there a pre-evil and a post-evil?
There was a lot of evil.
Less evil and more evil?
So the word medieval is actually a really interesting word. It literally means Middle Ages. Middle, evil, like coeval, somebody who lives at the same time. The word medieval was never used by anybody during the Middle Ages, right? It means that they were in the middle of something. Nobody says, well, I'm living in the middle of something, right? They lived during the reign of such and such a king, during a period, it's such and such a year of our Lord. The word medieval was invented by a bunch of Ponzi Italians during the Renaissance, who were trying to say that this is a moment of rebirth. Everything that came before us was barbaric. It's an invented term. Nobody in the Middle Ages ever referred to it, and the whole purpose of its invention was to refer to the period between the end of the classical era and the beginning of this new age that people like Pico della Mirandola and Leonardo da Vinci were claiming was taking place. It was their way of saying we're special because everything that came before wasn't. So if you remember last time, we talked about that perception of the Middle Ages as brutal, barbaric, primitive, something we owe to the Renaissance, as I never fail to remind my colleagues. Other questions?
I think I probably just missed it. The confession by Tyrrell or
Tyrrell, yes.
Tyrrell who was he?
Okay, so the question is, who was James Tyrrell? James Tyrrell was a figure at Richard's court. He was a knight, but he wasn't an especially important aristocrat. Supposedly, he is the person who actually committed the murders at the Tower of London of the two young boys. His name circulates very, very early, and supposedly right before his death, he confessed to the murders. However, the only sources we have for that are Tudor sources produced at the court of Henry VII, which means they're not necessarily terribly reliable. But the discovery of that chain and its connection to James Tyrrell provides new, interesting evidence that that confession may have been accurate, and he may have been the guy who did it. He certainly would be the person who was in a position to take the chain off of a dead body. Other questions? Oh, yeah?
So after the murder of Edward, there was no investigation by it. Like, they had the suspects, but they were just kind of like, we're just not going to investigate this any further, and then Ethelred takes the throne.
That's exactly it. Yeah, no. Edward is somebody who's much more useful dead than alive. A dead saint is always more helpful than a live king. And so, yeah, there is absolutely no investigation into his death, which in itself is pretty darn suspicious.
The Saint Kenelm of Mercia that you mentioned, you said that the entire thing was made up?
Entire thing.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, there was a king named Kenelm who ruled in the early 9th century.
And died at 35?
Died at 35.
Yeah, just some guy.
Just some guy, yeah, just some king. Was not murdered that we know of, was not particularly saintly, and wasn't a kid. So didn't fill any of the criteria, but made a great story.
I just want to know, do you in particular think that Richard killed the boy, or was involved in the death of those two princes?
Oh, I do. I think it's very hard to get around it. I mean, even so, the most basic thing is, if Richard didn't do it, you have to explain how the ruler of England completely disappeared from the face of the earth for the next several years. That somebody was like keeping him in a closet somewhere, just waiting for him to pop out. Remember, kings are surrounded by hundreds of people, right? It's really hard to just make a king disappear. So it's hard to imagine anybody other than Richard doing it, because otherwise you have to explain, where did these kids actually go and why did nobody notice? Yes? Absolutely. The question is, what were the circumstances around which Richard III's body were discovered? Well, we knew that Richard was buried in a monastery in the city of Leicester. And we actually even knew where that monastery was. Unfortunately, the remains of that monastery were under a parking lot, which says something about the transitoriness of history. So we knew that Richard is somewhere, very likely, if his body still exists at all, which is a question, he's very likely somewhere in basically a 1 square mile area, most likely somewhere under the spot where people are parking their cars next to the city mayoral complex. A woman by the name of Philippa Langley, who is the leader of the Richard III Society, and it's actually them who I was alluding to when I was saying people who really want Richard III to be a good person. The Richard III Society is basically a fan organization. Historians find them really annoying because you cannot say anything bad about Richard without getting like nasty emails and things like that. But Philippa Langley, to her credit, is one of these people who knows how to raise money and knows how to basically organize. And so she managed to get the funding and a connection with several universities, the University of Leicester, the University of Durham, to actually get permission to conduct excavations. And miraculously, on the very first day of the excavation, they excavated where they thought the higher altar would be, and there were the bones of Richard III. They've been confirmed by DNA testing. We know they're his. They've told us, as I said, we know about his health. We know about the circumstances of his upbringing. We know about the wounds he incurred when he, at perimortem, around the time that he died, including which ones were fatal. We know what position he was in physically when he received those wounds. We know that he wasn't wearing his helmet when he received those wounds. So the discovery of Richard's body gave us insight not only into just this figure Richard III, but actually into the life of medieval monarchy to a degree that we never had before. You can't just do DNA testing on a king's body, but we had the opportunity to do that. You can now visit Richard's new grave in Leicester Cathedral. It's quite beautiful. You can actually find his funeral service on YouTube. It's really quite lovely and kind of moving. But yeah, it is a moment of remarkable discovery. I mean, my email inbox was like this. Yeah.
Just related to that.
Oh.
Did they ever kind of pause any opinion on why they kept essentially his entire skeleton intact except for his feet? Because that's just kind of a weird point to make.
Yeah, that's not a complete skeleton, though honestly, given just the age of the skeleton and the circumstances under which it was buried, it would have been very unlikely for a complete skeleton to be found. It's more surprising that we have as much of him as we do than that there are pieces missing. Especially because this is a body that was pretty well hacked up before death, and then was buried very, very quickly under largely non-ceremonial circumstances. Henry VII wanted Richard's body off the scene as quickly as possible. So we all know he's dead, but now we just want him to go away so we can say whatever we want about him. And so they weren't really all that concerned with ensuring that the body would be preserved for ages. So we're actually lucky that we have as much of him as we do. Yeah.
You mentioned that after the death of the two princes, at least two people show up later claiming to be them.
Yes.
Do we know anything about them, and is there any merit to that claim?
So their names are, the question is, what about the two pretenders, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck? We know a bit about them. They were both kids or young men at that point of appropriate age. So they were at least close enough in age that they could have been the young princes. However, that's about as far as the evidence goes. Realistically, these were two young men who were used as figureheads by factions in the country that were opposed to Henry VII. There is absolutely no reason to believe that they were who they and their followers claimed them to be. They were both from basically small communities far outside of London. They appear to have been highly uneducated, to have very little, if any, sort of signs of royalty about them. And so people say, well, clearly they wouldn't because they were kept in these small towns and hidden away for years. But ultimately, it's a lot harder to believe that than it is to say that these were just two more of the kinds of royal pretenders that just actually popped up pretty frequently in the Middle Ages. There's no reason to believe that Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck were actually Edward and Richard, the young princes, killed and now brought back to life. Yeah.
So you mentioned the two different sets of bones that could be the princes. What would Richard's motivation be to bury them in Windsor instead of just leaving them in the Tower?
So the question is, why would Richard bury them in Windsor instead of leaving them in the Tower? That's a great question. And this gets back to what is actually the fundamental question regarding the death of the princes. Why, or what happened to their bodies? Why were their bodies never displayed? It would have been in everyone's interest to actually have bodies to be shown. Whether it's Richard to say that there are no other legitimate claimants to the throne, whether it's Henry to say, yeah, that awful Richard, he killed them. We don't know why the bodies never turned up. Certainly the vault next to Edward IV's vault in Windsor, it was a hidden vault. Nobody knew it was there. And so if we think about the killing of young Edward as a murder of God's anointed, you want to then treat the body of God's anointed properly, right? Even if you killed him, you want to make sure that, you're not incurring any sort of more posthumous vengeance or posthumous damnation than you have to. So you stick them sort of hidden away next to their father. They're in sacred ground, but nobody's actually going to know or see them there. That would be the justification, but nobody knows. The other question would be, how could you toss a king's body under a stairway and just think, nobody's going to notice, right? Hey, there's a new stairway there. It wasn't there yesterday. By the way, has anybody seen the king? So, that's the thing, is none of it makes sense. Any other questions? Yes?
Let's talk a little bit about the divine heart of the king.
Yeah, absolutely.
God's anointed.
Yes.
Early Britain, it's very tribal, very dispersed, no kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
Anglo-Saxons come, they're godless.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden we've got everybody as the king, and because he's chosen by God. So how'd that happen?
Okay, so the Anglo-Saxon tribes, when they first settled Britain, they are pagan. They are not Christian tribesmen, even though Christianity did exist on the island because it was brought there by the Roman Empire. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons begins in the late 6th, early 7th century, with missionaries coming roughly at the same time from Rome and from Ireland. So by the time we get to the 10th century, you're dealing with a solidly Christian kingdom that's been Christian for about 2.5 centuries now, or even 300 years. So by the time Edward the Martyr becomes king, he's not actually called Edward the Martyr in his lifetime, but by the time Edward becomes king, he is entirely a Christian king. He doesn't see him, there's no sort of surviving pagan belief system that he would adhere to. He is God's anointed by the Christian God. And that's how he would have seen himself. Pardon? Says the church, says everybody who lives around him. So, it's a Christian kingdom at that point. So everybody believes in this theology. So if the church anoints you and says, God picked you, that's who you are. And basically where these people come from is, they were the original tribal chieftains or the families of those tribal chieftains that gradually Christianized themselves when the rest of the kingdom was Christianized. The great, really funny thing about this, though, is we actually have a number of documents for that transitional period between Christianity and the pagan past, when the kings of these various small kingdoms were trying to figure out, what is this new Christian thing? How are we kings under Christianity just as we were kings before? And they produced these really elaborate family trees. Family trees were always important, because kings would like to trace themselves back to Odin or back to Thor. So they changed their family trees. I am the son of Odin. His son was so-and-so. His son was so-and-so. His son was Jesus. His son was so-and-so. His son was so. They just sort of stick Jesus right in there because it makes sense. That changes quickly once they start getting hold of the whole, Christianity theology thing. All right, looks like we're out of time. Thank you for staying. I realize we went a little long tonight. I look forward to seeing you next week.